Well, I started composing, quote unquote, air quotes, composing around seventh or eighth grade, and I'll explain that in just a second. But I started music back in fifth grade when I joined band as a saxophone player. I don't really come from that much of a musical household. I think my mom played flute in high school for like 2 years, and my dad plays a little piano. He plays like Billy Joel and Elton John, and like tries to sing, but he's a really good piano player. So we've always had a piano in our house. And so when I told my parents that I wanted to join band, I originally wanted to play the trombone because my two best friends at the time, one chose to play trumpet and the other chose to play saxophone. So I found it only natural to want to play something different than they were playing. So I went home and I told my mom that I wanted to play trombone, and she said to me, "Oh, that's great, but like, don't you want to play something with more keys?" And I thought to myself, "Oh yeah, you're right. I don't know how you actually make music on a trombone without keys." So I went with my second choice, which was saxophone. So I started playing alto saxophone in the fifth grade, and I loved band. And when I got to seventh or eighth grade, my parents definitely saw that I was really interested in this music thing, and so my dad, for Christmas that year, between seventh or eighth grade, I really don't remember, but around that time, he got me a small little MIDI keyboard and showed me how to hook it up to my computer and do some really basic sequencing like you would in GarageBand. And as soon as he showed me how to do that, I was totally hooked. And every day after school, after I did my homework from that point on, I would just spend hours at my computer just creating little tunes, little pieces for random instrumentations, like maybe recorder and piano, or a sine wave and steel drums. It really didn't matter. I was just sort of experimenting and coming up with like melodies and little tunes. I think I've always had the itch, like a lot of us do. I've always had the itch to create something, to build something. I think in elementary school, I loved drawing. I would draw like little pencil outlines. I remember in first grade, maybe of like a Garfield cartoon. Maybe I was just like tracing it or something. I don't really remember, but I would draw little black and white outlines, and our teacher would photocopy them for the class, and then during coloring time, we would like color those. We would color them in. And I remember a few years later, I really got into writing poetry, and I'll use air quotes again when I say that, because I was in elementary school and I didn't really know what poetry was, and I still don't really know what it is. But I would write these poems, and then I would create little poetry books out of like construction paper and glue, and I would draw on them, and then I think I would try to sell them to my teachers for like a few bucks. I don't remember if I sold them or if I gave them away or not. But yeah, I've just always really been interested in creating things, and even in junior high, when I started kind of messing around on computers more, I really loved like computer games like The Sims or like Roller Coaster Tycoon, where you could build these worlds, sort of like these Rube Goldberg like computer games. I just love that so much, and in a way, I think like music is sort of like a sonic Rube Goldberg. Like you start with a melody and you press go, or you start playing the piece, and then you kind of watch how this piece unfolds in really creative, various, colorful ways. So that's when I started composing. By the time I got to high school, I started studying composition privately with a guy by the name of Carl Schindler. He was a graduate student at Arizona State at the time. And I also started studying over the summer with my high school band director, John Gomez. And those lessons actually started as conducting lessons. I thought I wanted to be a conductor, I think, early on, like around 10th grade or so. And we quickly realized through those lessons that I was really not interested in conducting, but I was really interested in all the things that go into preparing a score analysis, score study, figuring out how a piece is constructed. Where is the melody? Where is the counter melody? What is the harmony doing? What is the bass line doing? And so those lessons, I think, quickly transformed from conducting lessons into composition lessons, or at least like musical analysis lessons, which of course helped me write the pieces that I was trying to write at that time. I'll pick up our conversation here with this second question. Well, that's kind of a loaded question. I'm not so certain that you can decide to become a composer exactly, or at least a professional composer. You can decide to write a piece of music, of course. And, like I was just explaining, I just had the itch to do it. I wasn't so concerned with whether I was doing it right or whether it would become a career or not. I was in like 9th and 10th grade. I wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking about doing my homework and thinking about playing in band and singing in choir and playing with my friends and writing music. And that's all I was concerned about. And it wasn't until about 11th grade, after I had started studying with my high school band director, that I began to think a little bit bigger. So in 11th grade, my band director gave me the opportunity to write a piece for our high school band. It was my first large ensemble piece, and it was a sort of a really slow lyrical piece. It was called Blue Ambiance. For whatever reason, there was really no reason other than perhaps it made me think of the color blue, in that it is a calming color. So I was in 11th grade, and I'd written this piece for our band to read through, and my band director was really kind. He gave me this amazing opportunity to spend 20 minutes of class time, of rehearsal time, reading and recording this piece. I still have the recording to this day. And that was the first time I'd really ever heard my music performed by living human beings. It had always been just kind of played back to me via the computer before that. I learned so much that day about what works when you're writing music and what doesn't work so well. I learned more that afternoon than I think I had the next 10 years of writing music. You just learn so much kind of instinctively when you hear your music performed live around other people. You can kind of just like feel the room get tense, or maybe I'm projecting my own anxieties onto that, but you feel what works. I mean, that's kind of what music is, right? Like a lot of it is theory, whatever, which helps clarify ideas. But I think that a lot of it is just gut reaction. And that's certainly how I've learned to write music over the last 15 or 20 years, just following my instincts. And you'll know when your instincts are telling you that something's not working, that's for sure. So I wrote that piece and I revised it so many times because it was really bad. I rewrote it 4 times, and on that 4th revision, my band director finally said, "You know what? I think this is in a good enough shape that we can perform it in a concert." The following year, as a senior, our entire music department was invited to play at Carnegie Hall in New York. And for this band and orchestra and choir from Mesa, Arizona, to go to New York City and to play in this amazing hall was sort of an extraordinary opportunity. And again, my high school band director, John, gave me the opportunity, or at least presented the opportunity, for me to write a piece to open up this concert. And he basically gave me the assignment. He said that it should be very celebratory and joyful, kind of like Beethoven's Ode to Joy, but it should also be like contemporary and modern, sort of like maybe the style of John Adams' Short Ride in a Fast Machine. And so I basically said, "Oh, that's a great idea." And within 10 days, I brought him in sort of a working draft of what has now become known as the piece Joyride, which is sort of a mashup of both of those ideas, of course. That same year, as a senior in high school, I was also invited to write a piece for the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra for one of their sort of family series Pops concerts. I had also written music for like a children's theater play. So I think as a senior in high school, as a young composer, I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. I really thought that the next 10 years of my life would turn me into a real working composer. I thought that I would go to college and I would get my undergrad degree in music composition, and then I would go get my master's and my doctorate, and then I would be a real composer, because that's how you do it. Or at least that seems to be how a lot of composers, become professionals. So I think that my senior year of high school was when I really hoped that, or at least that I thought that maybe being a composer was a path I could take. But when I got to college, I stayed in state and went to a university where there was no separate composition degree, which basically means that I had to be admitted on an instrument. In my case, it would have been saxophone or voice, and I would have had to major in performance on that instrument in order to minor or get a certificate in composition. And that wasn't something I really wanted to do. I was an okay performer, but I wasn't great. I knew I didn't want to be a professional performer, and so why would I spend all this time, practicing this instrument when I wanted to spend all that time writing music? And so, long story short, I was rejected from the School of Music because I had a really mediocre audition, and I had to figure out something else to do with the next 4 years of my life at this university. And so for a short time, I was a math major, of all things. I didn't really love math, but I had a really great Calc 2 teacher who made me think that I loved math. And then the next semester, I had a really boring, kind of straight out of Office Space Calc 3 teacher, and I kind of stopped going to those classes and needed to figure something else out. So I joined a lot of my friends in the film and theater department, and as I say, watched a lot of movies and cartoons for the rest of those 4 years and got a diploma. And so my degree is actually in film practices, which means I did a lot of hands-on filmmaking and also wrote a lot of essays about film theory. So this is all a long-winded way of me answering your question, why did you decide to become a composer? I tried to become a composer, and life had a different path for me. What was really interesting about this entire time was, even though I wasn't a music major, I was still writing music. And I wrote a piece of music called Shadow Rituals, which I submitted to a composition contest. It was called the Frank Kelly Composition Contest, sponsored by Frank's publisher, Manhattan Beach Music. It was my second semester of college, so I was my spring semester of my freshman year. I was a math major at this point. I was not doing music at all. I wasn't playing saxophone. I might have been singing in a community choir, but that would have been it. And I remember getting an email saying that Shadow Rituals had won first prize in this competition. And I just remember thinking, oh, maybe if people like listening to my music, and if musicians like performing my music, and if conductors like conducting my music and find enough substance in my music in terms of its craft and how it's put together, maybe I can still become a composer without that formal music education degree. And so I think at that moment, I decided to really try to make this happen and really try to take advantage of any opportunities that came my way in terms of writing music. So I won first prize in that contest, which meant the piece got published, and so it started to get performed. And when it did, I really tried to contact the bands that were performing it and ask if I could come to their concerts, or if they could send me a recording, or just whatever I could do to reach out and try to make friends and try to, create a network of colleagues. You really never know where, your next commission is going to come from, or your next performance is going to come from. In the filmmaking world, everybody says, "Oh, it's all about who you know. It's all about your network. Oh, you got to create a network." But in music, I hate using that word network, because I think it's really more about who are your friends, because it's your friends who are going to vouch for you and recommend you for that next job. I think we all want to just hire our friends, right? Because they're the people that we trust. They're the people that we know we get along with, who we like, and whose work we're familiar with. So I think over the course of the last 15 years, I've been really lucky to have made some amazing friends here in the band world, especially. Again, why did you decide to become a composer? Well, I don't know that you can decide, but I think that your friends will decide for you, because they are the ones that are going to keep your career alive to some degree. At least that has been my experience. So for me, whenever I'm asked to write a new piece of music, or at least whenever I'm paid to write a new piece of music, there are usually some strings attached. And they're not big strings, they're not big ropes or anything like that, but there's usually sort of a why, right? Like, why are you asking me to write this piece? Oh, well, okay. Maybe a band is opening a new performing arts center and they want to commemorate that with a fanfare of some sort. Or maybe their band director is retiring after teaching for 30 years, and they want to celebrate him or her for all that they've done for the program, so they'll commission a piece for that. Or maybe it'll be more tragic, and maybe somebody passed away and they want to write a piece to memorialize that person. Or maybe there's no strings attached, and it's just, hey, write whatever you want, Mike, which is a lot harder than the previous situations. But in either case, whatever they say, whatever direction that they give me as a composer, really helps to establish a proper tone, right? Once I kind of know what I think the tone of the piece is going to be, or the style of the piece is going to be, then I start to maybe look a little bit more inward. So for instance, one of the commissions that I had about 8 years ago, the only direction that I got from this band director was that she wanted to commission a piece that reflected sort of the spirit of her students. I think that's literally all that she said. As a composer, as a creator, you have to think like, oh, that's really vague, right? Like, what could that possibly mean in terms of music? So I started to just kind of let that idea simmer a little bit, and in the meantime, start thinking about what that meant to me. As a filmmaker in college, one of my favorite classes was this class called Critical Studies of Animation, which is a fancy college way of saying we watched cartoons. It was one of my favorite classes, and for my final presentation in that class, I decided to give a presentation on the music of Looney Tunes, of the old Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons. That was composed mostly by a guy by the name of Carl Stalling. And so, in my research for that presentation, I became fascinated and sort of obsessed with this kind of classic cartoon music. And I'd always wanted to try to pay homage to that style. And I thought that this particular commission would be the perfect opportunity to try that. So I wrote a piece of music called Famicius Fantasticus, which sounds pretentious because it's Latin, but it's also not Latin. It's fake Latin. It is totally gag Latin. So if you remember those old Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons from the 50s and stuff like that, I mean, who doesn't know Wile E. Coyote? One of the cartoons, well, first of all, they all kind of start the same way, right? It's the coyote chasing the Roadrunner, and the coyote's, he's got a knife and fork in his hands, and then all of a sudden you hear a ding, and there's a freeze frame of the coyote sort of in midair or mid-chase, right? And underneath it, the scientific binomial appears, which is, the Latin name of the animal. But in these cartoons, for every cartoon, that binomial was different. And so for one cartoon, the name of the coyote was Famicius Fantasticus, which is how Google Translate pronounces it for me. You could pronounce it any way that you like. That's also part of the gag, is that nobody knows how to pronounce it correctly and never will. But that basically, we can guess that roughly translates to fantastically famished, right? Like very hungry. So this piece is sort of a wild cat and mouse chase, Roadrunner, coyote chase. And I think that it really does capture sort of the wild and zany personality and spirit of this band director's students. I remember very distinctly being at the premiere for this piece, and being, backstage in the band room before the concert, and you kind of see this like nervous, excited energy from the entire band. I mean, percussion players were taking their, marimba mallets and sword fighting, and other people were like bouncing balls off of the ground trying to get it to hit the 30-foot high ceiling, that kind of thing. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is very cartoony. This is a very cartoony environment right now. And I think that is kind of how, or at least one of the ways in which, I get inspiration for a piece. Yeah, I don't think I was surprised to discover whether somebody liked a piece of music or not that I'd written. But something I never expected was when people would listen to a piece that I had written and come up to me and tell me how moved they were about it, because it got them thinking about something that was really personal to them in their own lives. Like, I think that's a little bit different than somebody just saying, oh, that was a great piece. Like, aesthetically, I really liked listening to that piece. I think I became so much more moved and invested in my own music once I started to realize that people were actually bringing their own experiences to my music, or maybe my music was somehow inviting them to bring their own experiences to mind. For me, that is what connects us, I think, as listeners. Like, when you hear a piece of music and it makes you feel a specific way, or it makes you think of a specific time in your life or a specific person, I think that's really powerful. And certainly for me, I think that has sort of become my new mission as a composer. Like, I don't want to write music just for the sake of writing music anymore. I want to write music that somehow finds that connection with other people. Well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the first thing I want to know is why is somebody asking me to write this piece of music? Because again, that is going to inform sort of the style or the tone that the piece is going to take on. And once I pinpoint that world a little bit, then I can start to actually craft a melody. I can start to work with harmony, and I can start to orchestrate and try to find the world of the piece from there. I grew up, I've always had computers in my life. I was born in the 80s, but I still had computers in my life. I think the first words I ever learned to spell were not actually like on a piece of paper, but were from a spelling program on our computer. And so, I'm not ashamed to use a computer as a tool in my composing. I will certainly tell you that they are very misleading in a lot of ways, but I use it as a tool. So I have a little synthesizer keyboard here in my New York City apartment. I don't have a real piano because I have a lot of neighbors all around me here in the city, and I don't want to bother them so much at all hours of the night. So I have like an 88 key keyboard, and that plugs into my computer, and I use notation software called Sibelius, which makes the music easy to read for musicians like yourself. And other than that, that's really all I use when I'm writing. Well, again, I think that's kind of tied into the tone, and I think it's really hard to just sit down at a piano, right, and just plunk out a melody. I think a good melody needs to take time. Like writing a paper for English class or something like that, it requires a few revisions along the way to be the best version of itself that it can. I don't know that there's a process that I have necessarily for coming up with a melody, other than you work at it. Maybe you find just like a little seed of an idea, some sort of like little itch that you want to scratch, and then you build off of that seed, and you take the time to let that seed grow into a fully formed melody. And the ways that you do that, are going to be learned from studying music theory and from studying other pieces of music. Well, I would keep coming back to that word connection. That's everything to me, and not every piece is going to be successful with that, and maybe not every piece should, but that's certainly one of my personal goals when I'm, creating anything. Well, now it's so hard to play favorites, right? One of the pieces that I feel especially connected to is one of the first pieces that I'd ever written, which I think I mentioned earlier, which is that piece called Joyride, which is the mashup of the Beethoven and the John Adams, the Short Ride in a Fast Machine and the Ode to Joy, which is the piece that I wrote as a senior in high school. And I think the reason why I'm going to call it my favorite is because, listen, I was young, right? I was 18 when I wrote it. It's really rough around the edges. But the reason that I love it so much is because I had no idea what I was doing. I was just following my gut and following my instincts. And I was just writing something that I thought that I would like to listen to and that excited me and that moved me. I think the longer that I am a professional composer, the more sort of the business aspects of writing music kind of weigh on your shoulders. Like, oh, am I going to write a piece that makes me enough money to pay rent or buy groceries or buy health insurance? Those are some really heavy weights to consider when this becomes your livelihood. And I think every time that I listen back to Joyride, even though it's not a perfect piece, it reminds me of a time when I didn't have any of those cares or any of those worries. And sort of that raw spirit is something that I really, really try to recapture in every piece that I write, or at least remember it and remember what that felt like, because that's ultimately the reason that I ever wrote music in the first place. Oh, it is it is a lot of feelings. It is anxiousness, it is relief, it is excitement, it is embarrassment. It is everything all in one. I can't. I really don't like hearing my pieces premiered for the first time in the concert setting. I feel so vulnerable and so out of place. I feel like all the eyes in the room are on me for some reason, even though it's not about me. It's about the musicians, right? It feels really uncomfortable. A lot of times after a premiere, I don't really even remember hearing the piece. Time just sort of like skips over those 6 or 7 minutes for me for some reason. Yeah, I really actually don't like listening to my music in concerts. What I do love are the days leading up to that concert when I can work with an ensemble, when I can work with a band in rehearsals and get to bring that piece to life for the first time and get to know the piece for myself for the first time. You would think you would know a piece because you wrote it for several weeks, but you really don't know what works until you hear it. And so I have a tremendous amount of fun getting to work with bands in that capacity, sort of playing mix master in a way, bringing out certain melodies or like rebalancing certain ideas, certain characters or personalities that maybe specific themes and melodies should convey. The stuff that you can't notate in the music itself. That is the fun part for me. And then, of course, the composing part is also terrible. It is the part where you're just, kind of racking your brain every single day with massive low self-esteem and incredible doubt all the time. But the rehearsals, that's the good part. That's, I think, why I write music. Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound like terrible advice, but my advice is just write as much as you can. Don't care about, writing quote unquote correctly or whatever, or like using proper theory or whatever. Like, again, going back to Joyride as my favorite piece, like I love that piece so much because I didn't care. I had no idea what I was doing and I didn't care about what anybody thought. And my advice to you would be, to the best of your ability, try to aim for that as well. If you want to draw a picture of a beautiful sunset, you don't need to ask other artists for advice on drawing a sunset. You know what a sunset looks like. So you grab the tools that are available to you, whether they're crayons or colored pencils or whatever you want to use, and you draw the sunset that you feel you want to draw. You don't need to read up on proper sunset drawing technique. or anything like that, unless you want to, right? Like, I feel like there's a little bit of a myth about composers in that composing is reserved for, people who are highly educated and highly sophisticated, and that really doesn't have to be so. There's certainly no end to how far you can go with your education, but I think that's true with any art or any craft, right? So if you want to write music, I mean, if you're singing a tune in the shower, that is composition, right? Like it can be as simple as that. So don't be afraid of it and just write whatever you want, really. You can worry about filling in the gaps of your, quote unquote education later, but right now, if you're just starting out, just write music that you want to listen to, music that moves you.